verses from this. Yeah, atahi atano nato kohi nato parosya atanahi sudantena natang labati du labang. So nato is the protector. So if you translate this literally, the self is the lord or protector of the self. What other protector could there be? And so some, especially I have to say the Brahminic or Hindus who are attracted to Buddhism will sometimes grasp upon verses like this and say, you see, you Buddhists have misinterpreted the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha is saying that the self is the Lord of the self. So the Buddha is saying that there is a self, which is the Supreme Lord. But this is just, I would say that is a forced interpretation. Put in normal language, what the text is saying here is that one is one's own protector. What other protector or Lord could there be? And then the next verse, the next line makes that clear, that when one is well disciplined, one well trained oneself, then one gains a protector that is difficult to obtain. And then another verse from the same chapter. Yeah, atana hi katang papang atana sankilisati atana akatang papang atanava visujati. Okay, so this, by the self, evil is done. By the self, one is purified. By the self, evil is not done. Wait, I'm sorry. By the self, evil is done. By the self, one is defiled. By the self, evil is not done. By the self, just by the self, one is purified. Purity and impurity are pachatang. They depend upon oneself. No one can purify another. So it's pretty clear that here, the text is not using the word atta to refer to a metaphysical self and ultimate reality, but just using the word atta, self, in sort of an ordinary conventional sense, that we each ourselves individually, we have the choice either to do evil deeds or to do good deeds. Whether one is defiled or purified, that depends upon oneself. And so the Buddha doesn't hesitate to use the word self, but he uses it in this conventional sense. There's a sutta in the Digha Nikaya, I think sutta number 9, where he says the Tathagata uses such expressions as self merely as conventions or means of communication without clinging to them. And so coming back to our sutta here, it seems that the way I would see it, that the Buddha is sort of playing a little bit, maybe even teasing the thinkers or disciples who come from the Brahminic background, sort of teasing them by using Brahminic or Upanishadic terminology to express or to describe the person who attains the ultimate goal of his own teaching. So if you look at it from a Brahminic point of view, so maybe a Brahmin hearing the Buddha say this will think, the Buddha is saying that the liberated person dwells with his Atman, which is Brahma Bhutena, with a self that has become Brahma, that has become the Brahman. But if we sort of understand it through the lens of the Buddha's own teaching, the sense is simply that the liberated person dwells having reached an ultimate state of purity and sanctity or holiness. And so in the translation, I tried to capture this and it's a rather weak rendering, but there's no other way to fully capture all of the ambience and the suggestions of the original text, which would have been picked up by an Indian listener of the Buddha's time, with a self that has become Brahma, the divine, holy power behind the universe. Maybe any questions at this point? There's a little bit of a digression into the relation of Buddhist thought to Upanishadic thought. Yeah, I have to look at, okay, you're wrong.
Yes, Bunday. I'm getting confused about this idea of self. Is Upanishad's idea of Atman the same self in the no self concept in Buddhism?
Are you saying that, does the Buddha explicitly reject the Upanishadic concept of self? Is that what you're asking?
No. I have thought that maybe the concept Atman is a subset of the idea of self.
Okay, okay. I think I understand. Okay, now I think I understand.
Okay.
Okay, let me see if I understand the question correctly. So maybe, are you asking, does the word self that's used in the Buddha's teaching of non-self, when the Buddha rejects the concept of self, is that concept of self fully exhausted by the Upanishadic concept of self, or does the word self have broader meaning?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I don't think that the concept of self rejected by the Buddha applies exclusively to the Upanishadic concept of self. The way I would see it is that it would include the Brahminic concept of self, but it would include all of every kind of conceptual formulation or fabrication that we might resort to when we raise the question, what am I? What is my real identity? And then we posit either an entity within the five aggregates as being a self, or we posit the existence of a self hidden behind or within or above the five aggregates as their innermost essence, controller. So it's not exclusively the self of the Upanishads that would include that, but it would include many, many varieties of these, you might call this the psychological self or the philosophical self. So when, for example, to take another philosophical example, when the French philosopher of the 17th century, René Descartes, posited, I think therefore I am. So here he's identifying I am with the thinker. So that which thinks is the self for Descartes. A thinking substance is the self. That would also be included in as a target of the Buddha's teaching of non-self. But I would think that even, we don't have to bring in such a heavily philosophical slant, but when we try even a rather unsophisticated individual, maybe let's take an example like an athlete who prizes himself on his physical strength and comes out and maybe an Olympic weightlifter. They have weightlifting in the Olympics? I don't know. Okay, so he comes out and shows his strength and stands in front of the crowd, flexing his muscles. So underlying that pride based on the body is the identification with the body. The body is myself. And similarly, maybe the beauty queen who prides herself on her form and her face. Again, even though they don't formulate a philosophical idea, that is, the body is myself, but they're identifying with the body. They build up the sense of their identity based on the body. And it can be similarly on the other side with intellectuals who build up their sense of identity on the basis of their intellectual skills. Or maybe the business person who constructs maybe a global corporation, the head of a global corporation, and takes over this company, that company, extends the enterprise into this country, that continent. So in their case, I would say that there's an identification of the self with the will, with the volition. So even, I would say, even without philosophical underpinnings, but there can be yes, sort of implicit views of self underlying those ways of thinking. Okay, does that deal with the question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, let us then go on in our sutta now. And some of these ways of illustrating these different types of persons will seem a little bit strange to us here in the 21st century North America, or even some of you coming from Asia. Unless you're living, if you're in India, maybe you know some of these. Okay, we don't have to go into all of the details. So what is the person who torments himself, tortures himself? So this comes a description of the types of ascetic practices that were common in the Buddha's time. And the Buddha himself had undertaken some of these practices during his quest for enlightenment. So the person goes naked, rejecting conventions, licking his hands. He observes various protocols regarding food, different protocols regarding going begging for food, the quantities of food, living on one saucer a day, taking food once a day, once every 2 days, even fasting for most days, taking food only once every 2 weeks. Yeah, and then we have practices like pulling out the hair and beard. I think those were Jain practices. Standing continuously, squatting continuously, using a bed of thorns, and so on. So these are different practices of self-mortification. And if we know the Buddha's teaching on the middle path in the first discourse, the Buddha says that the middle path is one that rejects the two extremes. One is indulgence in sensual pleasures, and the other is attakila matanu yoga, that is the devotion to self-mortification. So this is an elaboration of what is meant by devotion to self-mortification. And amongst the ascetics in India today, there are those who want to undertake these practices. You could see maybe in Rishikesh, in northern India, or Hardwar, there will be yogis who just stand all the time rejecting seats, or they'll stand on one leg, or they'll put the arms up and never put the arms down. And there's a sect that goes around of naked ascetics. They call them the Nagas. And they're very fierce ascetics. Probably if you go on YouTube, you could see them in some videos of the Nagas. They come. If you know the ceremony that's held is it every 7 years or every other year in India, called the Kumbh Mela. And the main one is Allahabad, where ascetics, yogis, swamis from all over India will converge at this place along the bank of the river Ganges. And so the area will be covered by thousands and thousands, maybe hundreds and thousands of yogis, ascetics, and millions of lay devotees. And then there's an auspicious time when they're supposed to take the first bath in that period of time in the river Ganges. And the ones who always are put at the forefront of the crowd to enter the river first are the Nagas, the naked ascetics. It's quite fascinating, but also very dangerous, because every so often when they have this entering the river Ganges, huge crowds of people will push each other to get into the river Ganges, and then there'll be a stampede, and usually few dozen, even maybe a few hundred people will be killed. And then the reason was it 2020 or 2021? I think it must have been 2021. There was a big surge of COVID-19 in India because the government refused to cancel the Kumbh Mela for that year. And so millions of people assembled at the gathering place, no masks, no, forget about social distancing. People are just crowded together. And then after that, for months, very, very sadly, the COVID spread all over India and thousands and thousands of people died. Even people who didn't participate, but the COVID spreads from person to person. So that's shows that if you're going to observe a religious practice, do it with wisdom, not with blind faith. Okay, so that's the person who torments himself. Then we have the person who torments others. And then here we have a person who's a butcher of sheep, a butcher of pigs, and so on, a hunter, a fisherman, a thief, and an executioner, a prison warden, or one who follows any other such bloody occupation. And I think today we can maybe expand the list of people who torment others, torture others. I don't know whether I should mention some examples now, but what we have going on in Ukraine, it's just so terrifying, terrible that I am hesitant even to mention it. But if you've seen the photographs coming out of some of these towns in the outskirts of Kyiv, Bucha, and Borodanya, I think it's called. People just, hands tied behind their back, shot in the head. Yes. And so And don't think it's only Putin and the Russians, but all around the world there are these dictators and autocrats who pursue this practice of tormenting others and torturing others. Okay, then we have the third type of person. This is the one who torments himself and pursues the practice of tormenting, the person who torments himself and torments others. And the example that's given here, it's a bit weird. I could follow the description, but I don't quite know the cultural background to this. Okay, so here we have some person who is a Kshatriya king or a wealthy Brahmin, and he's had a new sacrificial temple built outside the city. And to initiate that temple, they shave off their hair and beard, and they put on rough clothes, in this case an antelope hide, and they grease the body with ghee and oil. They scratch the back with a deer's horn, and he enters the temple. And this would be in the case of the king. He enters together with his chief queen and with the Brahmin high priest. And then he lies down on the ground covered with grass. And the king lives on the milk in the first tit of a cow with a calf of the same color, while the chief queen lives on the milk from the second tit, and the Brahmin priest lives on the milk in the third tit. And then they pour the milk from the fourth tit onto the fire, and then the calf lives on what is left. So in this way, he's tormenting himself as well as his chief queen and the Brahmin priest. And then he says, let so many bulls be slaughtered, bullocks, heifers, goats, sheep, and so on. So in that way, the animals are slaughtered or tormented. And then his slaves and servants, they have to make all of the preparations, threatened with punishment, and so they are tormented. So that's the kind of person who tortures himself, or torments himself and torments others. Maybe can we put this in contemporary terms? Can we come up with any examples of someone who would torment himself and also torment others? Does anybody want to have any ideas about this? Think a little bit. Don't be shy if you come up with some. Okay, Ian Chung.
Bhante would be your fierce boss being angry with his staff.
Fierce boss who's angry with his staff.
Yeah, the boss himself is tormented with anger, and he spreads his anger to his staff, and he torments his staff.
That's possible. Yeah. But let's take the case, maybe somebody deliberately torments himself. In that case, being tormented by the anger is a little bit sort of accidental or incidental. But we want to take the case where somebody deliberately inflicts pain and suffering on himself and also inflicts pain and suffering on others.
Bhante, boss from hell.
Say again?
The boss from hell.
I didn't quite catch it.
Oh, sometimes I have employees working with very difficult bosses, so we call them the bosses from hell.
The bosses from hell.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of a case of somebody deliberately inflicts pain and suffering on himself and then also pain and suffering on others. Okay, Sumana. Sumana.
Bante, thank you, Bante. I was thinking of a cult leader.
A what?
A cult leader.
Ah, that's a very good example. A cult leader. Yeah. In fact, that just brought to mind something that I had read this morning. Anyway, I don't have to try to get the article, but it was in the New York Times about photographers who go into scenes of catastrophe and take photographs which reveal those catastrophic events to the world. I think the article was called Photographs from Hell or something like this. And he mentions, like, there was a famous photograph from the late 1970s. There was a cult it was in Guyana in South America, but originating from the United States. The leader of the cult was named Jim Jones. And he had like about 1,000 people, followers from the San Francisco area. And they went and they settled in Guyana. And he was a very like a dictatorial figure with the strange ideas, and he inflicted lots of suffering on his cult members. And he must have been a very charismatic person. He got them all to submit to his control, to his domination, that said they would do anything that he said. And then this cult, their activities, somehow the word got out, slipped out, and the US government learned about it, and they sent agents down to investigate, and several congressmen came to investigate, and the Jim Jones cult found the congressmen and killed them. I think 3 congressmen were killed. But then further investigations took place. Further investigations took place, and Jim Jones knew that his days were numbered, that they were going to be exposed and maybe arrested and brought back to the United States for trial and punishment. And so he had his cult members prepare giant vats of a poisonous substance. And then he commanded them, family members, like parents, even little children, even their babies, had to drink the poison. And he himself also drank the poison. And the entire cult, all of them died. And then when the investigators came down to Guyana to see what was going on, they found the bodies of more than 1,000 people lying on the ground. And then there was a photographer who took the photograph. I just got the article. Jim Jones, he was an American cult leader, political activist. And this was done as a religious cult, preacher and faith healer. And so between 1955 and 1978, he led the People's Temple, a religious movement. And then they moved to Jones, they called it Jonestown after himself, Guyana. And then on November 18th, 1978, Jones and his inner circle orchestrated a mass murder-suicide in their jungle commune. Yeah, so we have these cult leaders like that who harm themselves and harm others. Any other examples? You're wrong.
I want to say that there in certain culture, there are women who believe that female is an inferior kind of people, inferior to men. Therefore, they would subject themselves to inhumane treatment in order to serve the needs of the men, and then they get their daughters to do the same.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I believe that practice is still going on.
The practice of, they call it female genital mutilation.
Right, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. They abbreviate FGM, they call that. Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah. And Johnny? Have to unmute. Johnny?
Sunday.
Okay.
In the case of Lord Yama, he's supposed to punish to teach. So how do we see that?
I take Lord Yama not literally. I take it just to be a symbolic representation of the fact of the way that each person goes according to their own karma. It's the way of reflecting one's own karma back to oneself.
Okay, so will that be okay for me slap on my hand that if I find myself make a mistake?
Say again, I didn't quite catch.
Will it be okay for one to punish himself or herself by slap of a hand?
I don't think that would be beneficial.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should move on. Okay, so now we've gone through the first three alternatives, and now the Buddha comes to the fourth one. And this is the person who doesn't torment himself or torment others, but who dwells hungerless, quenched, and cooled, Sukhapati Sangvedi, experiencing happiness or bliss, having with Brahmabhutena Atana Viharati, who lives with a self that has become divine. And then I'm not going to go in detail through the entire sequence here, but this is the sequence of what is commonly called the graduated, sequential, contemplative training within the Buddhas. It's a sort of fixed program that we come across again and again in the Buddha's teaching. Very common in it's very common in the Majjhima, in the Digha Nikaya, the first book of the Digha Nikaya, and in a number of suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya. And so I've explained this in detail in earlier classes, earlier programs of teaching that I've given. I remember 2 years ago when I was in California, I gave like a 5-day evening program based on this sequence. So to explain it in detail would take like about 4 or 5 classes, but we could just go through the main, let's say, the main features of this training. So it begins with the arising of the Buddha in the world, the Tathagata, and the teaching of the Dhamma. So those are what we call the 2 preliminary conditions for this path to the ultimate bliss to become available. So the arising of a Tathagata who fully understands the nature of the world and the nature of liberation, and then teaches the Dhamma, which is good in the beginning, middle, and end, and reveals the pure spiritual life, the brahmacharya. And then being India, ancient India, it's phrased in terms of a male, but we could give it a gender neutral application. So we have a person born in a person, whether a householder or some other clan, who hears the Dhamma and then acquires faith in the Tathagata. So that faith is another preliminary condition. So we have here two outer conditions, the arising of a Buddha and the teaching of the Dhamma, and then the internal or personal condition, the gaining faith in the Tathagata, specifically in the recognizing the Buddha as one who is fully enlightened and realizing the Dhamma as the good in the beginning, middle, and end. And then the person now is going to, the sutta is going to show each step of the training. And so this is going to be the monastic path. And so gaining this faith, the person considers the limitations of the household life, the benefits of the life of renunciation, then goes forth, shaves off the hair and beard, puts on the ochre robes, and goes forth into homelessness. And so this, we could say, is the stage of the going forth, entering the life of renunciation. Then comes the ethical training, that one acquires the precepts or training rules of the monastic life. And the first set are roughly identical with the precepts observed by a layperson, except that in place of abstaining from sexual misconduct, here, since this is the monastic life, what is required is the giving up of all sexual activity and abstaining from sexual activity and observing celibacy. So these are three principles of right action. Then come four principles of right speech: not lying, not speaking malicious speech or divisive speech, not uttering angry speech, and not indulging in idle chatter. So those would be principles observed also by lay followers. But then we come to the more specific types of guidelines for the monastic followers, like not injuring seeds and plants, eating, here it says once a day, but generally that means not eating after midday, but eating only between sunrise and midday. And then abstaining from singing, dancing, music, and shows, not beautifying oneself, not using high and large beds, abstaining from the use of money, grain, meat, from receiving raw grain and meat, women and girls, men and women slaves, animals, fields and land, and so on and so on. So all of that is part of we call this the Sila training, the training in ethical, or it's actually more than ethical, it's ethical and ascetic discipline. Then comes contentment, being content with the basic requisites of life, here summed up in robes to cover the body and food to maintain the stomach. And then wherever he goes, he sets out taking only these with him. And of course, he has a handbag in which probably be a cell phone these days, a computer, a few other things. But this is the ancient ideal, is to be carrying only the bare requisites. Just like a bird, when it travels, wherever it goes, it takes only its wings along. So the bird doesn't have to pack any suitcases, doesn't have to go to the airport and check in the suitcases. But we have now in front of the building where I'm living, just on the lawn, there are two geese that arrived here about a week ago. Probably they came maybe from the Caribbean or Central America or Mexico, where they had gone for the winter. Now they're living outside this building, and maybe in another week they'll go back up to Canada where it's cooler, and I don't see that they've stored their bags any place, but when they travel, they take only their wings along. So that is called contentment, being content with the simplest requisites. And so all of that, the observing of the training rules and the practice of contentment, is summed up in the Arya Sila Kanda, the aggregate or the mass of noble virtuous behavior. And even that alone brings a kind of sukha, a happiness or internal bliss of blamelessness, knowing that one is not doing anything unethical. Then comes the training in sense restraint, not grasping upon attractive objects of the senses or grasping upon repulsive objects of the senses. The attractive objects called trigger states of craving, and the repulsive objects can cause dejection and diversion. And so one restrains the senses. And by restraining the senses, then one experiences even higher degree of internal bliss. Then comes the practice of mindfulness and clear comprehension in all activities. Then I'm going to go a little quickly through this. Then comes resorting to a secluded dwelling. And maybe what's a little misleading is that when you read this, it seems that the monastic person is undertaking all of these steps of training, maybe in a couple of days, a couple of weeks. But actually, according to the Vinaya, the code of monastic discipline, before one goes off into seclusion, one should be staying under a teacher or senior monastics for a minimum of 5 years, gradually learning the Dhamma, training in the discipline, and building up the power of one's mindfulness and understanding so that one is equipped to go off to a secluded lodging. I have to say a little bit critically today, what's happening here in the West, but I observe these young people, they get ordination as monks, and then without staying under a teacher, they think, I'm a monk, and then they go off roaming over the United States on their own, maybe hitchhiking, I don't know, or walking, and taking photographs of themselves and posting it on Facebook and saying, look what I'm doing. And they get hundreds of likes, but no training, no discipline. And what will happen to the old tradition? I don't know. Okay, so then one resorts to the secluded lodging, one goes, after coming back from the alms round, one sits down, crosses the legs, and then one practices to tackle and overcome what I call the 5 hindrances: longing, craving, or sensual desire, ill will and hatred, tina mida, dullness and drowsiness, sometimes translated sloth and torpor, and then restlessness and remorse, restlessness and worry, and then abandoning doubt. Again, it seems that the meditator just sits down and boom, the 5 hindrances are gone in a couple of minutes. But in actual real life, this is pretty much a multi-year process, even a lifetime process of gradually working to weaken, to erode, and to overcome the 5 hindrances. Then in this full presentation of the training, when one abandons the 5 hindrances, then one enters upon the jhanas, the states of meditative absorption. I won't go into the detail of the jhana formulas, but we have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th jhanas. in which the mind becomes more and more deeply absorbed, more blissful, calm, more peaceful, until at the level of the fourth jhana, in which there's neither painful nor pleasant feeling, then the mindfulness is purified by equanimity. Okay, then when the meditator has become skilled in the four jhanas, then if he's so disposed, he could develop the higher knowledges. These are not strictly necessary, but in the full account of the process of cultivation, they're mentioned. The first is the knowledge of one's past lives, even going back to past lives over many aeons of world expansion and contraction. Then comes the divine eye, by which one can know the passing away and rebirth of beings. And then comes with the summum bonum, the high point, the climax of the process. And this is the essential one, the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas, the taints. And this comes through the direct experiential penetration of the Four Noble Truths, understanding with direct insight, not just intellectual knowledge, but with direct insight, the meaning of dukkha, its origin, its cessation, and the path. And then seeing the taints, their origin, cessation, and the path. When he sees and knows this, then the mind is liberated from the three asavas of sensual craving, craving for existence, and the taint of ignorance. And then when the mind is liberated, there comes the knowledge that it's liberated, that the round of rebirths has been ended, the spiritual life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, and there is no more coming back to any kind of samsaric existence. And so then the Buddha concludes that it is in this way that a person is one who does not torment himself or torment others, but who in this very life dwells hungerless, that's without craving, quenched and cooled, experiencing bliss, having himself become divine. So those are the four kinds of persons. Okay, we have a few minutes in which we can take some questions that might arise from this. So please, if there's any questions, just the way to, if you're not familiar with how to ask a question, yeah, I don't have it on mine because I'm the host, but you will have the bottom of your Zoom screen on that panel, on that line. One of the options is called reactions. And if you click reactions, then you get a number of icons. And one of the icons is a hand, a raised hand. And you click that, and then the hand will appear. It's so clever the way the designers of the Zoom included this function. Okay, so we take Gita first. You unmute. Okay, you're open.
Thank you, Bhante, for teaching us. I have a question for you. Just before the previous section that we did, you know, they talk about the Hindus sacrificing animals. Would this be considered the Sila Paramata, you know, where we give up all wrong practices of rites and rituals?
Yeah, certainly.
Right?
Excuse me?
No, I was just saying it sounds exactly like that, like what Buddha would have meant.
Yeah, certainly. What's called Sila Bhatta, or sometimes translated rites and rituals, but I would translate it more maybe rules and observances. It certainly includes animal sacrifice. It's not confined to animal sacrifice. It has a wider range, but animal sacrifice would be included in that, definitely.
Thank you, Bhante.
And Beck from Myrtle Beach. Whoops, okay. Unmute. Okay, now.
Thank you, Bhante. One question, please. The Hindus believe in transcendentalism, that the Brahma is connected to the Atman transcendentally, and Another example is like the avatars of Vishnu are all connected transcendentally. But from what I can understand, the Buddhism rejects transcendentalism because of the disbelief in an eternal soul. Is that correct?
What exactly do you mean by transcendentalism? That's a
Well,
little bit of a
like you know, like Brahma is one of the three Godheads, you know, transcendentally connected to the Atman is the soul. Within us is a little piece of this is the Hindu point, is that like we have a little spark inside of us is the same as Brahma. We're transcendentally connected to God with this little soul. But Buddhism rejects that, right?
Oh yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Johnny, did you have another question? You see your hand is still up. Okay, seems not. So I'll ask.
Question. I'm very sorry.
Okay. You have a question or not?
I don't have any more questions.
Okay. Yeah. When you finish, then what you do is to lower the hand. Okay, Kylie. Kylie?
Good evening, Bhante. I would like to ask Tom, torturing others, one of the occupation is butchers of pigs, cows. So we are eating them. That's why there are demands for pigs, cows, and then that's why they are becoming butchers. So is it that we those who eat meats indirectly contribute to the tormenting others as well?
Yeah, this is a constantly debated question, and I really don't want to get into that question itself. I think first, original Buddhism doesn't require vegetarianism. Later Mahayana Buddhism advocated vegetarianism, and in the Chinese, Vietnamese, maybe Korean traditions, the monastics are vegetarian, but not necessarily the lay devotees. But I think on ethical grounds, perhaps an argument can be made that when one purchases meat in a modern commercial food system, one is indirectly contributing to the continuation of the meat industry and then creating a demand for butchers and for animals to be killed. And so I would say that could provide an argument in favor of vegetarianism, but I don't want to insist everybody has to be vegetarian.
Okay, thank you, Bhante.
Yeah, but there's been articles and papers and essays and books from Buddhist standpoints arguing in favor of vegetarianism, arguing against compulsory vegetarianism, so it could go on forever. Okay, I think we're going to have to end now, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits, and I'll just recite the verses, and you could bring to mind anybody that you might know who is in difficulty, trouble, and could use through some subtle psychic vibrations some help to clear their mind or even to help them with their physical health. So first we'll share the merit with the Devas and Nagas, asking them to protect the Dhamma and to protect the planet Earth. And then we'll extend the wishes of loving kindness and compassion. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Sasanam. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Desanam. Akasata Chabumata Devanaga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mam Param Dukkha Patachani Dukkha Baya Patachani Baya Soka Patachani Soka Antu Sabepi Panino. May those in suffering be free from suffering. May those in fear be free from fear. May those in sorrow be free from sorrow. May all living beings also be thus. And then we do 3 bows to the Buddha. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
And a bow to Bante.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Go to Bande.
Okay, so thank you all for
Sadhu,
joining.
sadhu, sadhu.